So good morning, my name is Craig Dyke, Head of International Decarbonisation National Grid, here at COP26 at the National Grid stand in the Green Zone. Joined this morning by Nicola Todd, who is Head of Strategy and Innovation at National Grid, also Craig Lucas, Energy Transformation Director at Mott MacDonald, and Tom Howe, Head of Energy and Environment Decision at the International Energy Agency. We're here this morning to talk about electricity grids, energy grids, how they play a vital role in decarbonisation and the drive towards net zero. So you may have seen yesterday the announcement from Prime Minister Johnson and Prime Minister Modi about launching the Green Grids Initiative. That's an initiative which is all about accelerating the development of green grids in a way that actually helps us transform to renewable energy in all the energy markets. Tomorrow, John Pettigrew will be hosting an event which will launch the work plan for the Green Grids Initiative. And that will have world energy ministers line up and set out how they can play a vital role in supporting this broader initiative. But that's what the politicians are up to. We're here today to talk about what it means to us, what we're going to do as individuals and what we're going to do in our day-to-day roles. So, a little bit of a 30-second introduction from all of you. Nicola?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Nicola Todd. I'm Head of Strategy and Innovation for National Grid's Electricity Transmission. So I look after how we develop our business strategy for our electricity transmission business, and also think about how we steer our innovation portfolio and engineering portfolio in the right direction to meet the challenges of the future around net zero. Prior to that, I'm an engineer by background, and I've spent the last 8 years at National Grid, so a really fantastic place to work and really at the heart of the net zero transition.
Hi, I'm Craig Lucas. I'm Director of Energy Transformation at Mott MacDonald. Mott MacDonald's a global engineering consultancy business, and we've got many years working on transmission grids all over the world. And my role is really thinking about how we reshape our business as we address net zero. I'm also here as the chair of the Energy Policy Panel of the Institution of Engineering and Technology. So I'm thinking about this from an engineering skills and professionalism perspective as well.
Hello, and I'm Tom Howe. I'm at the International Energy Agency. It's an international organisation run for governments, which is full of energy analysts and economists and experts who look at energy policies and energy systems around the world and try to work out how they can improve, how they can ensure that energy is delivered securely and sustainably, and how climate concerns are integrated into energy policies.
Great, thanks guys. So we're going to have a panel session this morning, a bit of a conversation amongst us. So I ask a few questions to panelists and then pick up on it. So I guess the first question, which is to all of you, start with you, Nicola, because you just did eye contact with me.
Always a mistake.
What does a green grid mean to you?
Yeah, so I think there's a massive space to talk about and a massive thing to think about. But there's probably a couple of key points I would pull out from a green grids perspective. So, at National Grid, one of the big things we were thinking about is how do we connect the significant amounts of renewable energy that need to connect to the transmission system. And in particular in the UK, especially over the next decade, that's offshore wind focused. We've got targets around 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, which is actually massive in terms of what we need to do in an infrastructure build space. If you think about it, it's probably the biggest single transformation to the system since the system was established, decades ago. So it's really massive for us in terms of offshore wind connections. We're also, as a group, looking at how we develop more interconnection to the continent. So, looking at how we can therefore better manage intermittent sources of generation in the UK and on the continent. Looking at how we can better, exchange energy between those countries where we have, when the wind doesn't blow in the UK, actually, we might be able to import electricity from elsewhere. And then I think the other thing I'll sort of mention, because it's a massive space we could talk about, is around flexibility and storage and how we think about the demand side differently. So, as we see transport decarbonisation and more in the space of EVs, that's going to, again, require a whole change in how we think about the grids, the demands on the grid, when they're placed. And we need to think really carefully about storage solutions and flexibility across the transmission system and the distribution networks. To think about that kind of whole system side of the grid development and how we keep that, moving forward in the right direction.
Well, what are you, Craig, from Mott MacDonald perspective? Clearly you operate in various jurisdictions around the world. Where are you seeing big advances and what does this mean for you as a business as well?
I think I'll make 2 points. One is that the green grid enables the rest of infrastructure to decarbonise. So, as the IEA's report shows, energy usage is one of the major drivers of carbon across the whole economy. So the green grid has to enable transport, industry and built environment to decarbonise as well. So we're looking at it from that holistic perspective, working with players in those sectors who need to interact with the grid in a totally different way and really become much more involved in the energy market in a way they haven't had to before. I think the other point to make is that the solutions won't be the same everywhere in the world. There'll be different technology mix. We're in a northern climate with a large gas network, and the Australian solution might look very different in terms of what resources they've got. And if you look at Asian markets or the US, I'm sure that what the components of the green grid will look very different, but they'll all be driven by this question of flexibility and managing intermittency and managing a very different, bigger system with a much more electrified economy, which is going to be much more demanding in terms of the resilience that people expect.
How about you, Tom? Because the IEA, you look at it from that big global macro level, energy top, and there's a report I know you guys released the other week, which pretty much set out what the G7 countries need to do in order to hit net zero. Where do you see the green grids fit into that? How important are they from all your analysis and your reports?
Hugely. I mean, as you say, we produced this net zero report, which shows how the whole of the world can actually reach net zero by 2050. But it's a massive undertaking, and the grids are core to it because there's going to be a whole lot more use of electricity. Electricity is actually one of the less difficult sources of energy to decarbonise. So that's where the decarbonisation will happen first. So it's important that people understand that for that to happen, they need the reinforcement of the grids. Grids need to be flexible, they need to be dense, and they need to be interconnected to ensure that the renewables can be actually brought on and the power system is still going to work. And we work with governments and other players like yourselves all around the world to show that that kind of integration is possible. We have good examples in Europe and the UK and in the EU. There's really best practice in terms of showing the world how to integrate with different grids, how to have interconnected markets and create a bigger balancing area, all of which is necessary for a stable grid.
And that stability is really important, actually, and that's that balance as well between something you touched upon then, Craig, whereas not everyone's starting from the same place, and not every grid in the world is as stable as the UK and European grids were when they set off on this journey 10, 15 years ago. So there's a little bit around, there's a good blueprint in the UK and Europe, but you can't just roll that out everywhere. So I guess from your experience then, Craig, and certainly in some of the Southeast Asia stuff, how do you think we can help support some of those countries in making that transition? Because they won't have gas as a transition fuel, for example.
Well, I mean, they can sort of leapfrog some of our own learning, if you like. I think that's one of the main ways in which we can help. And I think the expertise we've built in integration of renewables is really valuable, and it is transferable. Although the system might be different, the learning about how do you manage and operate a net zero system is going to be a global question that we cannot, we're hoping will be a very valuable knowledge base for us. And that includes being more digital, using power electronics, architecting the grid very differently. And I guess like mobile networks and telecommunications, people might be able to build a very different system using green hydrogen and storage and other vectors in different ways. So there's a few different things there, I think.
Just on that then, so you touched on a good point about data and digitalisation. I'm going to come to you on this, Nick, as Head of Strategy and Innovation. Yeah. Everyone talks about it, and it can mean all things for all men or women. What does it mean to you, and how do you think it will fit into your strategy for National Grid?
Data and digitalisation. Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of areas where it fits in. So I think part of it is about how we make our own operations, better and easy for our engineering teams. So they're dealing with much more complex grids to design and to manage and to look for solutions. And so being able to do that in a much more effective way is really important. I think the other thing from a digital perspective is we're thinking a lot about how we maximise the use of the existing grids, because we've got a lot of new infrastructure to develop, but also there's more we can do around getting more data from our existing system so we can better utilise it. So things we're thinking about are things like dynamic ratings, that's used across the world, but actually is there more we can do in that space to understand real time what the system is doing, how it's performing, how weather is impacting the system, and therefore making different decisions about how we manage power flows across the network. So again, being able to exchange that data, get that in real time, is going to be a massive tool for us in terms of how we transform the grids. And I think moving forward, not just for the electricity transmission business, but thinking about our system operator business, being able to get that again, thinking about vehicle to grids, for example, where we've got EV rollouts. How do we get data around what EVs are doing, how they're charging, discharging, and how we better use that to again manage that kind of flexibility around the grid moving forward. So it's massive for us in terms of how we transform our business and transform how we use the grids in the future.
Yeah, and I guess it's that. I just got one of the questions here, which is around, because there's a big certainly COP26, from what I see, the big macro focus on top-down, policy-driven, big changes. And ultimately, I then step back and go, where's where's the consumer in all this? How does the consumer play a role?
Yeah.
Just picking up some of the analysis IEA does, which is great from a macro perspective. So where do you see the consumer fitting in? Us as individuals, because we have a major role to play in driving towards net zero.
Sure. Yeah, we do the micro stuff as well. I mean, it partly depends on the different structures of markets around the world. They're very different. I mean, here in the UK, for instance, you can actually request a contract which is selling you renewable electricity. So that way, the household, the consumer, can actually be a market player and provide an incentive for renewables to come onto the grid, into the market, and the grid therefore has to be built up to facilitate that. In other markets around the world, you don't have that direct relationship. Sometimes you've got the big corporates doing it, so the Googles, the Apples, who contract for 100% renewables, so they can provide a market incentive for renewables to come on, and then again, the grid has to be capable of bearing that penetration. So that's both as a householder in some markets or big corporates, you can get a final consumer incentive.
And I think, I was talking to someone actually on the National Grid stand yesterday about the kind of consumer side of things, and we were talking about how we make the consumer experience such that people want to transition. We make it easy for people. We don't make it this really clunky, awful, complex. Because the energy industry has maybe felt a little bit impenetrable. I can say it to people outside of for a long time, and actually how we help people interact with it is really important, and we make that user friendly, because if we don't, then it would just turn people away from it.
Yeah, I reflect that. When I started in electricity networks, which is many years ago, we never talked about customers. We talked about the regulator a lot, but customers were kind of not as high up in the hierarchy as keeping the regulator happy. Now we need to really genuinely think of ourselves as a service business. How do we provide utility and service to people? If you think about EV charging, we've seen from the studies we've done that it can save huge amounts of infrastructure costs if you use it the right way. So how do we create a service model where that benefits the consumer and they want to do that, and we're not just telling them to use less or make their life more awkward? So I think we've really got to go on a journey on what that service model is.
I think you're right. I think it is our service model. I was speaking to the CEO of Kraken Flex yesterday, which is part of Octopus. They do some great stuff with an app around, you tell them when you want your car charged, and it sorts it out right time for you, right time of day, the greenest, the cheapest. And that is really attractive to consumers, because everyone's in apps these days. I've got so many bloody apps charging EV. So how do you think the disruptors like Octopus and Google and Apple, where do you think they're going to play a role? And where do you think they're going to move in this space as well, somewhere?
I reckon they will, but I mean, you've mentioned both regulators and other institutions. That regime also needs to adapt. So one of the other things we do is engage with the regulators, the Ofgems of the world, because they've got to be able to at least allow these new players, these new technologies, these new apps into the market to work. Whether it's on the household side, where you're programming your car charging slot, or on the demand management side, where electricity suppliers are able to act more smartly with the apps. So there's an institution aspect which also needs addressing.
And there's something about, again, how we think very holistically about that. So in a way that people don't have to have 8 apps to charge 8 different types of EV charging station on, because then, every time you get there, like, oh, I've not got that app, I need to download it. So again, it's about how do we make that transition easier for people so it doesn't feel like a burden, it doesn't feel complicated. We all have a role to play, but actually, we need to try and, as you say, become a bit more of a service industry and really think about the end consumer.
But does the end consumer understand what the service is, though? Can you really get them engaged in electricity as a thing? Or is it they just want that light on, they want to be warm, they want their food hot?
Yeah.
And is there a need for the industry to therefore change its language a little bit?
I think so, and I think it's a bit about that point I was saying earlier, where we've made it quite inaccessible. I've changed word because I can say that word. We've made it quite inaccessible to people, and you're right. I think people don't always want to know that something is different. They want it to be. They don't necessarily want to change their lifestyle in a lot of ways. They want to, as you say, just put the light on and it turns on. They want to unplug their car and it's charged. They don't maybe necessarily care how. So then it's about what do they need to know, and what do we as an industry need to be thinking about.
I think that's true, but also we need to think about people's drivers and motivations and what interests them. I've got solar panels in my house. My father-in-law is 80 and he doesn't speak English as a first language. And I had a very long conversation about the economics of solar panels with him because he was interested in the financial side of it. So if you can get... People do want ease and convenience and things, but if you can see something that benefits them, they will be interested in it.
No, that's fair.
Yeah. I think I literally got 9 apps to charge my EV.
Well, and that's the thing, isn't it?
And you've got to download the app, and you can't. There's no 4G signals. You can't download. Yeah, I feel your pain. So take it back up to I guess to an international sort of level. A little bit you touched on, Craig, around how do you? Because you're right. I think it'd be wrong for the Western world to tell the rest of the world what to do, because we've been on a massive journey and we've got a lot of things wrong. What do you think are some of the steps we can take so that, to your point, they can leapfrog some? And actually, to a point, I can see some countries actually advancing ahead of the UK and Europe. What some of the key steps you think we can take in that space?
I think the point you made about regulation, really capturing how do you create regulatory frameworks that enable the right outcomes, I think that's a crucial factor. We've been through a lot of regulatory learning, and we've made a number of mistakes on the way, and we still haven't quite got it right. We've made some things overly complicated, I think. So if we could sort of distill, what have we actually learned from this experience that is transferable and useful, I think that would be singularly valuable. And then I think businesses that are in this space will look at the global market and think about how can they translate their models to the global market. So we need to give space to that innovation as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, we've been engaging in Southeast Asia with ASEAN countries, but also with India and China, big players, because they've got to go through this same learning process. But as you say, they can learn from our mistakes, and hopefully the leapfrogging is there.
Yeah. And the thing we've been doing is we've spent time talking to people in other countries and other grids about some of the technology and innovations we've been deploying, and actually while they don't have the same challenges, they can use the same technology in a different way to adapt to the challenges that they have. So it's about sharing our learning on when we've been deploying some of these technologies, so again they can not make the mistakes we have and they learn from it, so that they can deploy these things quicker and make that transition faster.
And what about, because we always talk about the fact that a lot of the technology needed to drive the change exists, or it's in the innovation stage and it will exist at some point. But a lot of the conversations we have, and certainly we went through this in the UK, were around that cultural change, believing you can move to that space and operate a network, for example, is carbon free, like the electricity system operates in 2025. Where do you see, or who should be looking at that cultural change? How do you drive that cultural change at a global level?
Big question.
It is a big question, I don't know.
Well, I mean, you take it step by step, you break it down. You can't swallow something so enormous as such a change as this. So it's learning from us, but it's realizing that it's, before you start looking at international interconnections and common regulatory regimes, just what can each regional regulator or each regional electricity company be doing to reinforce its grid, both distribution level and transmission level, but sort of breaking it down and step by step.
I think there's a kind of, the IET talks about low regrets decisions.
Yeah.
We have this when we talk to non-energy clients who are becoming very embedded in the energy sector by nature of the fact they're big demand users and they're building renewables, and they don't really understand the energy market or the industry. And it's like, what do I do first? You do the first thing that is sensible to do, and you understand it, and you build your knowledge base, and you start to build competence and supply chain, and then all of those other things follow. So I think, we can probably help people short circuit some of the steps that maybe we went slightly over there, or slightly in a good way. But just giving people that confidence, like what's the low hanging fruit, or the early thing that I need to do to prove something out, or get where I need to go.
And I think when we speak about kind of networks specifically, networks have been typically low risk businesses. That's why we have the level of resilience we've got in the UK, is because we are a relatively low risk approach, and you can understand why. The impact of getting it wrong is massive. So actually there's a lot of us to do in terms of looking at our setups and our own organisations of, are we being innovative enough? Do we need to do more? We're talking a lot in my team about innovation culture and how we change that in National Grid. So we're doing a lot of great stuff in the innovation space, but we can definitely do more. And how do we focus our efforts in the right places on innovation and thinking about the problems we're going to have in 5 and 10 years' time, so we're getting those products, those services ready, so that when we've got to deal with that issue, we're good to go rather than being behind the curve.
And is there a role, I guess, out there for those leaders, aren't necessarily world leaders, but those figures that now become the climate change champions? So, Fatty Brawl within the top 100 in most influential in the Times magazine. Is it people like Fatty that are going to actually take us forward? People will follow then if we get the right leader and the right voice out there.
Well, it certainly helps. I mean, Fatty's really good at giving very clear messages that show people the way and break it down. Clear messages about, to get to net zero, we need to boost electrification. look into methane, look into energy efficiency, give clear, simple messages. And then after that, once people grasp the big vision, then we can sit down with them and walk through the nitty-gritty and get into the detail.
There is another thing, sitting in the supply chain, we are learning a lot of things in Europe, and we're going to productise what we've learned. We will take that to other markets. And we'll say to people, if you need that kind of service, here's how it can be built and architected. So there's a role for business as well, and to really seize it as an opportunity. We see, from what we've done, it's an export opportunity, frankly.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. So how is, because as you touched on whole system, we'll come back to that in a little bit, but whole system is not just about transport and engine tracking, but it's the whole supply chain. So what does the whole supply chain need? Because there's some certainty needed to invest in R&D, invest in building new factories. So do you think there's something missing at the global level, Craig?
I think the skills challenge is huge, just the volume of skills, and also we won't be hiring. We will need a more digital workforce because of the direction of travel of this whole agenda. So, what is the skills mix we need, and how do we get it? And some of it will get through retraining people that are already in the sector, that are in perhaps areas of the sector that are not growing. And we've done that internally. We've done an internal program of retraining people, starting in our Asia Pacific area. We're now doing that kind of thing in the US markets as well. But also, we just need the groundswell of expertise and more STEM people in the market, I think. And that's the biggest challenge, I think. And if the supply is out there, we can all respond to it.
I think that skills challenge is really important. And actually, I would say that, at least for me in National Grid, we're starting to feel that almost now. It's not a future problem, it's a today problem. We're doing a massive recruitment campaign at the moment, and because we're struggling to get the skills in the power system design space and the digital space, because the market's not there, and actually we're all looking for the same skills across lots of different businesses. So I think that's a today problem as well as a problem that's going to grow over over the coming years, definitely.
But do you think that could get worse at that global level, though? Because ultimately we're
all doing it, right?
Every country in the world will be looking for the same skills. So a bit I then try to understand is how does all that come together? Where does it all come together? And does it need to, or is it? We all just can keep fighting for the same resource?
No, I mean, governments are aware of it. Governments are also having to gear up to help either the education, the infrastructure to help with the training, to build up the workforce. I mean, governments like to hear stories that there's a whole new job opportunity out there. So it's a matter of gearing up our education infrastructure as well. So it's, again, looking at that supply chain as well to provide the jobs. But the other aspect of education to flag up is just with the general public and people needing to understand the role of grids and the importance of investment in grids. There's still quite a degree of resistance to grid infrastructure being built everywhere around the world. That's a common problem. But you've got to involve people and get them to understand why it's important. So that's another aspect of the education discussion.
Yeah, but I guess the thing that gives me the hope in a lot of this is that when you speak to younger people, they are really motivated to work in this, in a job that makes a difference. So I think the buy-in from young people is there. Actually, they want to be in an area that makes a difference, and so we need to help them get into the jobs that are, the things that are going to interest them, that, study the right things at school so that they go through that pipeline. So I think we've got a captive audience, actually. We just need to harness it in the right way.
No, I completely agree. But then I was going to come back to the whole system. I guess a question across all three of you, really, and particularly internal when we interview with each other. How does... this goes back to the conversation I had yesterday at the session, which was around... It came back to resilience and security supply, and the conversation kept diving into resilience within the electricity sector. But if we keep talking about the whole system, ultimately you need resilience across the energy vector, so electricity, transport, heat, aviation, and ultimately, if you get the right resilience across all of them, it should work. So how does all that happen and move forward quickly when ultimately, when you talk about a whole system, you could spend years and years just agreeing what it all means?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we need to think about how we work across industry much more collaboratively moving forward. As you say, this is about the whole energy economy. Everyone who consumes energy is part of the future problem and the solution. And so we need to find a way, and I'm not sure we cracked it yet, but we need to find a way to work much more effectively, much more collaboratively across different businesses to make sure that we're driving forward in the right direction. I think to your point about moving at the same pace, I think there are industries that will be slower to evolve, to the point earlier. the electricity network is much more mature in terms of how it decarbonises electricity. That's very different from aviation space and which is much less mature. So I think there's a bit of recognition that actually it's not all going to be at the same pace, and what part do we each have to play in the different time horizons on that solution, I suppose, as well, I think is really important.
I think with my sort of IET perspective, we look at this as a whole. It's a science and policy question, really, and we need to help policymakers understand the interdependencies we're creating. Because we're creating a society that's way more dependent on electricity.
Yeah.
And if you're heating your house, all of your transport needs, all of your communication needs, your ability to cook, your ability to run a water supply, if all of those things are dependent on a sort of single electricity system, then the onus is on us to explain and understand those dependencies and help think through what are the standards we actually need to build for, and what are the things we actually need to create in terms of the regulatory model and the business models that need to be created. And we talk about this whole innovation agenda, but we could create new risks as well by kind of creating a market where something becomes systemically risky, and we didn't foresee that. So that there's a big job for us as a profession to do to really help unpack this whole systems question.
Yeah, no, but I think you just link up everything into the electricity sector. So already just within the electricity sector, there's plenty of things that we've learnt over the last 100 years about what's a risk in delivering power, and what can we do to preempt that, what's the resilience we can build into the system. So a lot of that we've already learned, and we can roll that out as well as start to adapt to the new world.
And clearly in a world of greater electrification and greater use of data and digital, around resilience, things like cyber become much more of an area of consideration. So, as you say, there's a whole load of risks we know about from how we've evolved the grid, but there's a whole load of new risks that we have to keep on top of, and so that's a massive part as well in terms of how we manage resilience moving forward.
And on that, cyber's a really good point, actually, because there's and so you link that back to the data and digitalisation conversation, which is about getting all the data out there, let people use it so they can make the best decisions for them, whether it's a company or end consumer. I guess how do you balance that, releasing all that data versus that cyber risk, versus the fact it's critical national infrastructure?
Yeah, it's really challenging, and actually that's where we're as National Grid, we're obviously constantly looking at, because we own and operate critical national infrastructure. It's a massive thing for us is how you deploy things quickly and in the right way, but in a way that's secure enough, and it's a real challenge. And I think, again, that's where we're going to see a real growth in the need for skills around coding and programming and AI and digital, and how we make that sufficiently secure that we understand the risks and we can manage them. I think that's a massive space for consideration, but it's a massive challenge.
Again, this came up in a panel session yesterday around the drive to net zero and the electrification of everything. How much of a risk could there be? Is it, as we drive towards that, everything starts getting electrified, and that first power cut, no matter where you are in the world, does that then set net zero on the backward step?
It can depend how resilient the grid is. I mean, we have a history of centralised grids, but the whole penetration of renewables is decentralising our grids, and there can be an upside to that. So there can be resilience coming from massive diversification of your different power sources, so that you don't get a national blackout just from one power station going down. So in that sense, there can be an upside to the greater complexity and diversity.
I agree with that. I think we plan things in a top-down way today, and we've got all these things that we call behind the meter as we're energy. We're going to need to use those resources, and we're going to need to find ways of making that structured enough that they can contribute to the resilience debate. Why are the solar panels in my house turned off when there's a power cut? Because the grid operator can't control them. In the future, that won't be the right answer. So it's that sort of, we need more of that sort of thinking, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking of the smart apps and so on, and creating an interest for consumers. If consumers their app tells them that prices are good and they can be sending electricity from their car off into the grid, or curbing their own consumption, or sending their solar power off into the grid and making money out of it, that's another way to involve households and create a much more resilient and diversified grid.
And that decentralised point is really interesting about how, as you say, like how do you manage resilience, not just at a national level, but at a local level. So when there are, challenges on the system, how do you break that down in a way that means it's not an impact for everyone and we minimise the effects of that? So it's really thinking about resilience in a very different way, isn't it?
And taking it up a level as well, because clearly technology's there, engineers comfortably know what to do. Politicians, hopefully at COP26, will start making the right decisions and putting in their NDCs, fingers crossed. But somebody has to pay. Well, that's not the end consumer. Somebody has to invest from the start, the financial institutions around the world. Have they got the right incentives at the minute to invest their big capital funds in the growth of renewables?
What we've observed post-COVID is a huge shift in financial market sentiment. So the COVID situation caused people to look at their asset holdings. If you think about people that manage large amounts of assets, which of these assets are climate secure? And there was a synergy there. Some of the things that have the most climate risk were very impacted by COVID, like some of the transport assets or some of the oil and gas assets. So there's a hunger from the financial community to put their money into something that looks more long-term resilient. But I'm not sure the whole scale of the market and projects is there to service that hunger yet. I don't think a lack of money is the problem. I think perhaps a lack of deal flow is probably the issue at the moment. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Yeah. I mean, maybe one of the small upsides of the COVID crisis was everyone's confronted with a shock to the system and the need to think about their daily risks, the resilience they have, and that's opened up, particularly in the financial world. That's combined with, again, the political talk at COP, including on finance and the need for sustainable finance. You've got more and more international banks and aid agencies moving away from investments in coal and other fossil fuels and increasing the flow of cheaper money to green investments. So as you say, the capital is there. The pipeline is difficult, and building up the pipeline of projects is partly about the regulatory regime as well. So again, come back to the issue of talking to the regulators to help get rid of the lengthy delays in planning regimes, reducing the insecurities of developing a project. That will help bring in the investment and get the investments done.
And I think that point about that pipeline point is really important, and how I think there's a question, open question in my mind about roles and responsibilities around that. So whose role is it to go and talk to the markets, to talk to people about these things? As National Grid, we've been trying to do a lot of supply chain engagement around this is what 2030 targets look like for us, and this is what the pipeline of projects is. But actually, in a world of potentially competition and maybe National Grid maybe not delivering some projects with a bit of uncertainty there, whose role is it to go and have these conversations? Whose role is it to go and talk to people? I think is a question mark maybe in my mind of, I think we're all trying to do the right thing and do our best, but we've got to have clear roles and responsibilities and know whose job it is to actually go and have those engagements.
Where do you think the politicians play a role in that?
Yeah, I think they play a massive role actually. I think they need to be setting the direction and clarity of direction, but also not just high level headlines, but a bit more detail on what that really means and providing some clarity of how we're going to do this. And I think that then sets out clearer roles and responsibilities for those of us in network companies as to what we need to do as part of that.
And from your experiences around the world, is that similar around the world from what you guys see?
At every level.
Yeah.
You've got to have the political engagement at the local level, whether it's about getting one single project off the ground and approved by locals, but also dealing with the whole legal regime, making sure the laws are there supportive of this new investment and the new energy economy. So yes, at every level around the world.
I think that's right. The setting tone is important, but when you've got your project and the assets last 20 years and you need to get to financial close, then all of those other things need to be there as well. The detail does matter.
And I think we find that, when we talk at a macro level about net zero and the need to transition, people get it, in our consultations we've done on projects recently, people get it. But then when you start to talk individually about we're putting this transmission route here and this is the impact on you, then that's clearly where the rub is going to come. So people get it conceptually, but then we have to think about specifics and how we make that work for people.
Does that, from where you sit there, Nicola, do you see that massive change needed in that engagement with communities? Engaged in a way you probably never have in the past.
Yeah, I think so, and I think one of the things we're trying to do is take it project by project is really important, so we can explain the local impact to people, but we also need to tell a better story around the holistic network and how that's going to change, and so people understand the bigger picture. What they don't want is us to talk about one project, then 5 years later come and talk about another one in the same area with the same people impacted. So we have to plan much more strategically. We have to plan and look at how we consent things much more strategically, and how we, with the regulator, how we talk about projects in a much more strategic way, so that we can explain how each project is part of a bigger picture, before we can then have a good conversation at a local level.
think the other thing that this is a global trend is looking at social outcomes in every infrastructure project in the broadest sense. So those sorts of issues, and then what are the jobs and employment dynamics around the project? What are the other social outcomes in terms of the broader environment that people are in, and all of those things matter now in a way. Energy clients didn't worry about them 10 years ago. Now it's absolutely top of mind, and they're really concerned about their license to operate, if you like. And it's because of the volume of what we're trying to do and the pace at which we're trying to do it. We need to give that much more attention.
I guess we've had a good conversation. I'm just conscious of time then. So I'm going to put a single final question to all of you then. If you could ask the world leaders for one thing to come out of COP, what would you ask them for?
Good question. You've got to come to me first because I'm
I'll
sitting
go
there
to
ready to
Tom. Go to Tom first.
Give me some thinking time.
I guess in a practical way, it's the level of ambition. We've made progress. There are now 56 countries who've declared that they will achieve net zero by more or less the mid-century. So getting the vision there is clear, and then coming up with NDCs and the policy to implement it, and being everyone, including Fatih Birol, able to break it down, communicate it clearly what is needed. You've got the vision, and then break down step-by-step, bite-sized pieces so that people can understand and buy in.
I think I'd build on that and just say, don't be afraid to speed up that level of ambition either. We've shown that we can do huge changes to our energy system in an incredibly short space of time that none of us would have thought possible. But back 10, 15 years ago, we all thought this industry was glacially slow. And it's amazing what we can do. So I think don't be afraid of speeding up. The industry will rise to the challenge. We will find a way to do it.
Yeah, I think the big thing for me at macro level is just, we've talked a lot about what we need to do, and now the rubber has to hit the road on actually doing a lot of it. So we've made some great changes, but it needs to go faster. And we need to not penalise companies trying to do the right things and move things faster, quicker. And so for me, that's what it's about. We need to make this real tangible change, and we need to continue the momentum that's built up in the kind of lead up to COP26 and make sure we sustain that.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. So that concludes our discussion on Green Grid this morning. We covered a load of areas this morning around financial side, supply chain, where the consumer fits in, whole system, and that clear need, that real clear message for politicians to just get on and get stuff done. But that's where we all play a role in this. Politicians can set the strategy, they can set the policy, but it's up to us within the business to actually make it actually happen. So let's just like to thank Tom, Craig and Nicola for their time this morning. And don't forget to tune in through the day and through the rest of the week for other messages, other videos that will be coming to you very soon. Thank you very much.